Lecture 22, King Arthur, Fact or Fiction?
As we turn to Arthur, I would like to paraphrase Sir Winston Churchill in his History of the English-Speaking Peoples. Historians have timidly but resolutely affirmed the historicity of King Arthur. I think it does little harm to say that in the darkest days of England's history, there stood forth a champion who, with his Knights of the Table Round, held firm the banner of Christian civilization against the forces of a valiant, disciplined, and barbarous foe. And as he was writing these words, the war clouds were looming heavily over Europe, and in a few years he would be called upon to be the new King Arthur, with his sturdy retainers, the British people, first holding at bay and then conquering a valiant, disciplined, and barbarous foe. The world of King Arthur, as we know it, belongs to the high ages of medieval chivalry. But its historical kernel lies back in those very same dark ages, that early period of the Middle Ages, in which the Beowulf was composed, and indeed in which the Beowulf had its historical kernel. The period of the 6th and 7th century A.D., the age of Anglo-Saxon expansion. As we saw, in 410 A.D., the Roman Emperor Honorius told the Roman Britons that the empire could no longer take care of them. They were thrown upon their own resources. And since the 3rd century B.C., Angles and Saxons had been attacking Roman Britain, and now they began to come in ever larger numbers, not just to raid the coast, but also to settle. Now, the annals for this period, our actual historical sources, are very scanty indeed. But the story was told that the Angles and Saxons had first been invited by the Roman Britons themselves. When the Roman legions withdrew, and that is historical fact that they withdrew in 410, various Romanized Britons began to struggle for power. The Romans had conquered Britain in the 1st century A.D. Already in the time of Caesar, a century before that, the legions of Rome had landed in Britain. But now, in the 1st century A.D., they conquered it, and it became Britannia. And from the south of what we call Britain, all the way up to the north of the country we call England today, the dividing line between our England and Scotland, the Romans ruled. The Great Wall of Hadrian, running some 77 miles across the division between Roman Britain and the land of the Caledonians, marked the limit of Roman expansion, except for a brief period, about 25 years later, when the Romans built a turf wall a little further north. But essentially, Hadrian's Wall marked the limit. But within that, Roman Britain was heavily Romanized. Roman cities like London and York and Lincoln flourished. Most of the population spoke Latin, some of them keeping their ancient Celtic language. Beautiful villas were built, large, expansive working farms. Britain exported all manner of goods, including woolens, including oysters. Wine was produced in Britain. But this civilization came under attack precisely because of its wealth when the Roman legions were finally withdrawn. It came under very serious attack. And as the annals tell us, one of these Roman Britons, struggling for control and hoping to take the place of the Romans, was Vortigern. He was a tyrant, and to gain an advantage over the other local kings who had stepped into the place of the Roman Britons, stepped into the place of the Romans, in order to gain advantage over them, he sent to Germany, to the land of the Saxons and Angles, and particularly to two brothers, Hengst and Horst, and invited them to come over and give him aid. They did, but they then stayed. And when Vortigern tried to make them leave, he invited them to a large festival, and they agreed that they would come, that he would pay them off, they would go back. None of them brought weapons, but of course you could not trust these Angles and Saxons. Treachery is part of their way of life, and there is nothing dishonorable in being treacherous to a foe. So they had hidden in their shoes these daggers, which at the appropriate moment they brought out, killed the Roman Britons, and began to take over the land. We can certainly document this archaeologically, because starting around 420 AD, Anglo-Saxon and Jute burials, these very similar types of burials, began to move from the coast inland. And instead of just being a few scattered burials, these Germanic Anglo-Saxon burials began to become dominant in the eastern part of England, moving on towards the west, on towards what we call Wales today. So the archaeology shows that the Angles and Saxons began to settle. But the annals then go on, and as we piece them together, there was a strong reaction. And for about 60 to 75 years, the Roman Britons put up resistance and held the Saxons at bay. By the 12th century, that is to say, almost 650 years after these events, this had been developed by the historian Geoffrey of Monmouth. And around 1150, he compiled a history of Britain. And in it, for the first time, we find full-blown the story of Arthur's role in this. And it was Arthur, according to Geoffrey, that had led this resistance. Arthur had been sired by Uther Pendragon, who himself was the son of Ambrosius Aurelianus, a very good Roman name, who had been the first war chief, a dux bellorum, a leader of war, to stand up to the Saxons. And Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing in the 12th century, gives us our first clear indication of the development of this cycle of stories about Arthur. We may already find traces of Arthur in the 7th and 8th century in Welsh poetry and annals, because Arthur, of course, is not an Anglo-Saxon hero. He's not a Beowulf. He's a hero of the Roman Britons. He's a hero of those who kept their Latin language in some part, but gradually reverted to their Celtic language of the Welsh and the Cornish. And you'll remember that in Anglo-Saxon, Welsh just means a foreigner. And of those Britons who finally migrated out of what had become England to France and established Brittany, where the Celtic tongue is still spoken. So Arthur is their hero, and the origins of his story lie in the west of England, in Cornwall and in Wales. I think, like Churchill, that there is no harm in saying that Arthur was a real historical figure. I believe, indeed, that he was a Roman Briton, a warlord who led the British in a series of victories, culminating, as tradition tells us, perhaps around 516, 521 AD in the great Battle of Mount Badon. It was said that Arthur led the British to 12 victories over the Anglo-Saxons, concluding with the Battle of Mount Badon, where he killed almost 1,000 of them, and where he carried the cross of our Savior on his shoulder for 3 days. So Arthur was a Christian. Arthur was a Roman Briton. And around Arthur, the most remarkable set of stories grew. Stories that came to embody the highest values of the age of chivalry. And that is when the story of Arthur first makes its presence known in France, all the way to Italy, into Germany. And it may well be that a poet of genius, Chrétien de Troyes, writing about Arthur and the knights of his Table Round, sometime around 1190 AD, took the small fragments of information about Arthur and began to transform him into this paradigm of chivalry. What is chivalry? Well, it is one, an age of knights and their ladies fair. It corresponds to the social and economic system called feudalism, in which the king is no more than first among equals, that his great barons have their land from him, they owe him allegiance, they send to him in time of war their finest knights, and in return are rewarded by the king, where kings hold great feasts in towered castles, and where the central values are 1, honor, never to break your word, 2, courage, 3, love. There is little room for romantic love in the fierce pages of the Iliad or of Beowulf, but love is the very center of the ideal of chivalry, the love of a knight for a lady fair. And almost always she is married to someone else, but he remains pure and chaste in his love for her. And he does all manners of great deeds. He goes on quest so that he might be worthy of her. And Arthur's very birth carries with it the theme that we have seen with Jason and Theseus, the theme of a miraculous birth. So let's begin the story of Arthur. And for our main source, let's take one of the great books of English literature, the book called The Morte d'Arthur by Thomas Malory. Malory himself was a knight. He saw service in the 100 Years' War, but he was also a rather rambunctious fellow and ended up in jail for assault of various forms and ultimately died in prison around 1471. But during his long period of imprisonment, he had access to a small library and wrote a magnificent summary of the tales about Arthur. It was published in 1485, one of the earlier published works. Published only around 1453 did Gutenberg invent printing, and it was printed around 1485 by William Caxton. Once been a fairly wealthy merchant and then went into the publishing business. And Caxton himself edited rather severely the work of Thomas Malory. So it's almost a joint work, but it is written in magnificent English. And by this time, the Anglo-Saxon had been transformed into our English, transformed with a very strong dose of the Romance languages, of the French, of the Normans. It is beautiful prose. It has this great theme of Arthur as the emblem of the noblest values of chivalry. And it certainly can speak across the ages. Not many people are going to sit down and read all of this long Morte d'Arthur, but it constantly appears in television and movie versions, and many people are attracted to it. So it does speak across the ages, even though our own values are very far removed from those of chivalry. So in the story of Thomas Malory, the Morte d'Arthur, the death of Arthur, Arthur is born in a miraculous fashion. Arthur's mother is the beautiful Queen Igraine, and her husband is a powerful lord in his own right. He is ruler over 2 fortresses, the Castle Terrible and the Castle Tintagel. Both of these are located in the story in Cornwall, and at least the remains of one has really been found there in Cornwall, in that most southwestern part of England. And his high lord is Uther Pendragon. Uther Pendragon, the high lord of all of the British, gives an invitation to a festival. And Igraine comes with her husband, and in the course of the festival, Uther Pendragon's heart absolutely is lost to the beautiful Igraine. And he wants to be with her, to make her his wife, at least in fact, if not in name. and his amorous glances are taken up by Igraine. She turns to her husband when she has him aside and says, "Darling, I think King Uther Pendragon has designs upon me." And, well, says the Duke of Tintagel, "I will not have that. I will overthrow my allegiance to him. I will withdraw my support." When he does that, of course, that's breaking the bond between Uther and the Duke of Tintagel, and war begins. And a siege is begun around the Castle Terrible. And that is where Uther has his army, and that is where inside the fortress the Duke has his own army. But the Duke wants to protect his wife, so he has sent her off to the Castle Tintagel, which will always remain the birthplace of Arthur. And, she is there, her husband's about 10 miles away, and suddenly there appears upon the scene the magician Merlin. And the Middle Ages was the epoch of magic. From the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire to a slave in the field, everyone was quite convinced that there were seemingly humans who had magical powers. Many of them had made a pact with the devil to have these powers, and these powers could be used for good, they could be used for ill. They could make you fall in love with someone, they could make a business deal go right for you, or by contrast, they could make someone fall out of love with you. They could make a business deal go bad. And right on down until the 17th century in our own country, people were executed for being witches. Witchcraft is a very enduring part of human nature. We find it all the way back into the Old Testament. And of course, it's central to plays like Macbeth. So Merlin would be taken by the audience of Thomas Malory as being a real person, a real magician. And Merlin has a very curious background, how he comes to be, who he is. In some stories, he's even related to Aurelius Ambrosianus as the first the war chief and now the sort of spiritual chief of the British. At any rate, Merlin appears to Uther Pendragon and explains to him, "I can get a son by Igraine that will be your child, but you have to do what I say." "I'll do anything," says Uther Pendragon. "Then you go with me, and I will transform you into the exact likeness of her husband. And you will sleep with her, and she will think she's sleeping with her husband, but you will get a child upon her. Now, my price is I want that child. I want to raise him." "All right," says Uther Pendragon. "That's fine. I don't want the responsibility of a child anyway." So he then rides off towards Tintagel. Then the Duke sees him riding off towards Tintagel, then sees him turn around and come back with more troops. So it looks as though they're going to make a mighty attack upon the castle of Terrible. We're at the Castle Terrible. And then, once again, Uther Pendragon rides away. This time, the Duke strikes out, attacks the forces around his Castle Terrible, and in the fighting, he is killed. But of course, there are no text messages, no way of alerting Castle Tintagel that the Duke has been killed, and his wife is there, when suddenly her husband appears. And he comes in with knights who look like knights that normally accompany her husband, and he says, "My darling, I just cannot be away from you any longer. I must spend the night with you." Well, of course, it's Uther Pendragon looking like her husband. And he spends the night with her. She has no knowledge that he's anyone else until the next day the message is brought to her, "Your husband, the Duke, was killed. Killed in battle." When? Why, that can't possibly be. 3 hours after the time you're telling me he was with me. "I don't know, my lady, but all we know is we were there and he was killed." "Who can this possibly be that was with me if it weren't my husband?" Well, the baby is born, and Merlin says, "I will take this child, but you're a widow now. Yes, yes, I am. And Uther Pendragon doesn't have a wife. Why, he doesn't? No. So why don't you two get married? Well, Igraine says, I need to protect her. Uther Pendragon says, I'm glad to marry you. So within just a few hours of the birth of the child, they are married. So the baby is illegitimate, but Merlin works it back so that, in fact, in the minds of the subjects of Uther Pendragon, they have been married even before the baby was born. So the baby is born. Uther takes her for a wife, but he then takes the young Arthur and turns him over to two knights he knows well, Sir Hector and Sir Hector's son, Sir Kay. And Hector's wife nurses the young Arthur, and he grows up in the household of Sir Hector and believes he's Sir Hector's son. Thus he grows to be about the age of 14. And he then is with his uncle and his man he considers his father, and then with his brother. And the three of them are riding towards Westminster, where there's going to be a great festival held at Christmas time. And when they arrive, there are knights there from all over England, several of them having aspirations to the throne, for Uther Pendragon has passed away. And as they ride in, the knights are all standing around this stone and looking at it and pondering about it. And then, because on it is said, whoever can withdraw this sword will be High King of England. Well, they all go away and have their festival, and then they are going to joust. Now, that is central to the code of chivalry. Knights ride against one another in full armor. They break their spears. They fight with their swords. And in reality, men of high birth, even sons of kings, and kings die in these jousts. They are very serious matters indeed, these tournaments. So they're going to joust and prove their manliness and their worthiness as knights. But young Sir Kay reaches down and says, I've forgotten my sword. Well, Arthur says, I'll go get one for you. So he starts riding off, but he realizes that if he rides all the way back to the castle, he will not get there in time and get back. Thus he says, wait a minute, what about that stone? And he stops, no one's around. He just reaches in and pulls it out and gives it to Sir Kay. And Sir Kay's father looks at it and says, that's not your sword. Where did it come from? And Sir Kay says, I pulled it out of that stone, father. Boy, did you really? No, I didn't. How did you get it? Arthur gave it to me. How did Arthur get it? Arthur said, well, I just pulled it out of the stone. That can't be. Let's go look at it, the three of us in private. Put the sword back in the stone. They put it back in the stone. Sir Hector tries to pull it out, and he tugs and he tugs. We can't. And then Sir Kay tries and pull it out, and he can't, and he can't. And then little young Arthur, not yet even a knight, reaches in and pulls it out, the sword that will be known as Excalibur. He puts it back in, and all the high lords and dukes come, and each of them try to pull it out, and they can't. And Sir Hector says, I bet Arthur should have a chance. Why, he's not even a knight yet. It doesn't matter, let him try. So he reaches in and pulls it out. This can't be. This is some sort of magic. Put it back in and we will come at Candlemas. We'll come on February the 2nd after Christmas. We'll try again. This can't be right. And they all come and they keep pulling. Nobody can get it out. Finally, Easter comes. Still can't get it out. Then Pentecost. And all through the story of Arthur, Pentecost, the day in the book of Acts when the disciples were called and the apostles were called to go out and preach in tongues, that plays a central role when they were empowered in the name of Jesus. And so on Pentecost, all the dukes try again, all fail. Young Arthur pulls it out. So the miraculous gift of the sword. So miraculous will it be that there are at least two versions. And in one of these, Merlin takes Arthur out to get his sword. And they go far to the west. And there, in a river, a miraculous arm reaches up and throws the sword to Arthur and then disappears beneath the waves. So he has his sword. Excalibur means cut steel. And Arthur is now proven to be the High King of England. And all the lords swear allegiance to him, and he decides to wed. And he has chosen for him as a bride, with the advice of Merlin, Guinevere, most beautiful woman in the kingdom, her own father, a king in his own right. And as a wedding present, he gives them the Table Round. In the most versions, 150 seats. But it is meant to replicate the table at which Jesus held his Last Supper. And the knights are to be true Christians, worthy of their Lord, worthy of their faith, defending it against all comers, loyal and true. And at Camelot in one version, or as Thomas Mallory tells us, Camelot was the same as Winchester. And in fact, in Winchester today, you can still see what you will be told is the Table Round. And at Camelot, Arthur built his magnificent court. People search for it. Distinguished archaeologists thinks he has found it at Cadbury, where there is indeed a strong fortress, large for its day, built just around 600, perhaps a little earlier, around 550, maybe even around 500, but strengthened all during that period, and clearly inhabited by Britons, not by Anglo-Saxons. But Camelot ceases to be a real place and becomes instead the symbol for the values and aspirations and hopes and dreams, a place where everything is good, no bad things happen, and where men and women trust one another and serve the Lord, serve their King. And so Arthur is happy. And there at the round table, all the seats are ultimately filled, some with the finest knights of all of Christendom, like Sir Gawain, Sir Percival, and Sir Lancelot. Only one seat remains unfilled, and that is the seat, the Siege Perilous, the dangerous seat. And there is written, only he who is utterly chaste, only he who will find the Holy Grail, only he is worthy to sit here. There come ambassadors from the Emperor of Rome, the Emperor Lucius he is called in the tale, demanding the traditional tribute. And Arthur will not pay tribute to a king of Rome. And thus he leads his army all the way to Italy itself, conquering along the way, conquering in France, conquering in Italy, and is himself, Arthur, crowned Emperor of the Romans. So everything is as it should be. His knights go out daily on quest, and it is their rule that they will not sit down to eat their meal until each of them has seen something marvelous, carried out some extraordinary quest, killed a dragon, rescued some damsel in distress. And they're all like brothers sharing around this table. And Arthur loves his wife Guinevere with a deep and abiding love based upon the most absolute faith in her chastity and her love of him. But nothing's perfect. And Lancelot, in almost every way, with one exception, the very perfect knight, undefeated on the field of battle, afraid of no dragon, afraid of no demon that might rise up, pure in his love of Christ, but utterly in love with the beautiful Guinevere. And she reciprocates. And for a long while, it is that ideal of chivalrous love, that ideal of courtly love, where Lancelot looks at her only from afar, and their glances meet. But there's no personal physical relations between them, only that of a knight who serves in every way the lady and her king. And so, let us leave Arthur there with his dream of Camelot and the knowledge that one day all of his knights will go off on a quest, the last great quest, the quest for the Holy Grail. And the brotherhood of the Round Table will be broken forever.